Okay, fantastic. Well, we're very happy today to have Chuck Marohn from Strong Towns here, and read Chuck's bio, and then we'll get started right off the bat. So Chuck is Charles Marohn, known as Chuck to his friends and colleagues. He's the founder and president of Strong Towns and the author of recently published Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution to Build American Prosperity. Great book. He's a professional engineer licensed in the state of Minnesota and a land use planner with 2 decades of experience. He holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master of urban and regional planning, both from the University of Minnesota. Chuck is also the lead author of Thoughts on Building Strong Towns, Volume 1, 2, and 3, as well as the author of World-Class Transportation System. He hosts the Strong Towns podcast and is a primary writer for Strong Towns web content. He has presented Strong Towns concepts in hundreds of cities and towns across North America. He's featured in the documentary film Owned, A Tale of Two Americans, and was named one of the 10 most influential urbanists of all time by Planetstein or Planet Zen.
I think they say Planetizen.
Planetizen. I'm trying to convert it to another language.
It's a planning geek website.
Marohn is a longtime commenter on KAXE Northern Community Radio. He's currently a co-host of KAXE's Dig Deep program, a monthly examination of public policy issues affecting Minnesotans. Chuck grew up on a small farm in central Minnesota, the oldest of 3 sons and 2 elementary school teachers. He joined the Minnesota National Guard on his 17th birthday during his junior year of high school and served for 9 years. In addition to being passionate about building a stronger America, he loves playing music and is an obsessive reader and religiously follows his favorite team, the Minnesota Twins. Chuck and his wife live with their 2 daughters in their hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota. All right, well, we welcome Chuck Marohn. Welcome to Fate.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's very nice to be here. Justin just went out to shut off the music. Is that what you sent him out for, Will? Because I'd be good with it on all night. I'm like, this is the coolest music I've ever heard in a city hall. That's very nice. Thank you. It's very nice to be here. My name's Chuck Marohn. I am the president of an organization called Strong Towns. I've actually been on the road pretty much solid. I have a few days off since October 1st when our book came out. Tonight I was supposed to fly home, and I got an invitation to come here to Fate. And I looked and said, okay, not what was on my schedule, not what I was planning to do. I would really like to be home, but I absolutely have to go to Fate. We have 2 people in the back here, Michael and Justin, and I'll say this and then we'll be done and we'll move on, because I know I've had people come to my city and stand up in front of my peers and say nice things about me, and everyone's like, yeah, okay, whatever. But we're doing this very important work across the country, trying to figure out how to build strong towns. Will, too, I didn't mean to leave you out, friend. These guys here are part of a group asking some really difficult questions. And when we get through the presentation tonight, you'll see just where we're at. But I couldn't go home without coming here. If I had an invitation to be here, I wanted to come here and meet, chat with these guys again. They've been to our gatherings, our stuff. They're a regular part of our conversation, and wanted to make sure and come here and not only do them the respect of being part of this place, but I'll just come here and see it and meet all of you and have a really nice conversation. So I've spent all week talking to people who are really interesting. These are three guys here that are doing hard work, and I just wanted to come here and make sure and respect that. Real briefly about our organization, our mission is to support a model of development that allows our cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. I'm from a little city, Brainerd, Minnesota, a couple hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. I grew up on a family farm, a place that was homesteaded by my great-great-grandparents. I spent the early years of my career building the kind of city that you are living in here and dealing with some of the struggles that you are currently dealing with in terms of growth and development. In 2008, I started to write this blog. The blog grew and took off in ways I wasn't imagining, and now I find myself here with you tonight. Part of the reason why we're here, we released a book on October 1st We've been on a book tour ever since. I say we, I had a colleague that lives in Denton that was traveling with me this week. He had an emergency and had to go home, so he's not here. But I've been on the road since early October, sharing this message really all over the U.S. Seattle, Manhattan, D.C., Philadelphia, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin. This week is Louisiana and Texas. So Monday was Lafayette, Tuesday was Shreveport, Wednesday was Dallas and Fort Worth, Thursday was Denton and Duncanville, today back in Dallas, and I get to finish up the week here in Fate. You, I recognize from somewhere, right?
Yeah, the regional gathering last year.
Oh, that's what it was. Nice to see you again. Tell me your name again.
Kevin Butler.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. I have a few copies of the book. They're $25 each. Jacob would be here normally to take your credit card and do whatever. I'll do that afterwards if you're interested, and I can sign it for you too if you would like. I would like to get rid of all those books because then I don't have to carry them on the plane. I want to start the conversation the way I end chapter 3 of the book, and that is by talking about Detroit. As I've traveled around the country and met with people, everybody seems to have their own explanation of what has gone on in Detroit. If you're on this side of the political spectrum, you have an entire explanation. If you're on this side of the political spectrum, you have an entire explanation. They make sense, they're coherent, but there's really no overlap. In fact, everybody I talk to has their own explanation for what has gone on in Detroit, and the only thing these explanations seem to have in common is one observation: my city is not Detroit. There's nothing about our city that resembles what's gone on in Detroit. It's very different. They're two very different places. I want to give you the Strong Towns explanation of Detroit. If we look at Detroit in the late 1800s, early 1900s, before Henry Ford, before the automobile, this was one of the wealthiest cities, not just in North America, but in the world. You had such intense wealth, such buildings of grandeur and opulence that you could drop something like the Detroit Opera Hall, which was built in the early 1900s. You could drop it into any European capital today, and it would be right at home. This was an incredibly wealthy city. And when they started to become the Motor City, they started to experiment with the automobile. They were the first city in North America to try out this new development pattern. They were really the innovators. They were the first ones to have commuter suburbs, to have people who would live out on the edge and then drive in during the day to work, drive back at the end of the day. They were the first ones to run highways through the middle of their neighborhoods to make this happen. They were the first ones at scale to start tearing down buildings to build parking lots, expanding outward to facilitate more of this growth and development. And by the time we hit the Great Depression, and cities around the country started to go into bankruptcy and collapse and have huge fiscal problems, the city of Detroit fared relatively well. So much so that by the end of World War II, as local leaders, mayors, city council members, professionals, Rotary Club presidents were saying, what do we do? What do we do to bring about prosperity in our community? It was very clear to everyone what needed to happen. We needed to copy the development pattern pioneered by one of our most successful cities, that being Detroit. And that's what we did. We all copied Detroit. Detroit's not some crazy, weird anomaly. Detroit's not some strange place that's different from all of our places. Detroit's just early. They're just a couple decades ahead of every place else. When you take a wealthy and prosperous city, you spread it out over a huge area, creating all these liabilities while you denude the underlying tax base, you get the insolvency of Detroit. Like every bankruptcy, it happens gradually, then all at once. My mother got an advance copy of the book. When she finished chapter 3, she called me up and she said, "Chuck, this is a very depressing book." I said, "Mom, stick with it. It gets better." My mom will tell you that it does get better. But I like to start with Detroit because Detroit is a good way to think about the shift between cities as complex adaptive systems and cities as something that is merely complicated. What's the difference? Complex adaptive systems, we can think about something like a rainforest. A rainforest, we grasp, is made up of many different flora and fauna. They all are independent of each other. They all act independently. They all receive different inputs. They get stress and opportunities presented to them in different ways. They're able to respond independently. When we look at the order of a rainforest seems ordered, but it's not ordered by design. The order of a rainforest is said to be emergent. It is created from this complex interaction of these many independent actors. This kind of ecosystem is understandable to us. Sometimes, though, we have a difficulty grasping human ecosystems. Human habitat, something that evolved with us, co-evolved with us. These are systems where for thousands and thousands of years, humans would try different things. What worked, they would expand upon. Again, many individual actors working not in a coordinated way, but in an independent way, reacting to stresses and opportunities, evolving a place, evolving a human habitat. These are both complex adaptive systems. This is very different than systems that are merely complicated. A Rube Goldberg machine is very complicated. It takes very brilliant people to put one of these things together. The novelty of one is the complication. There's all this stuff going on. But we understand that if we go and cut one of these strings or move one of these blocks, the Rube Goldberg machine doesn't adapt. It doesn't emerge different qualities. It just breaks. It just stops working. Think of your automobile engine. If your automobile engine is stressed and pushed beyond its limits, it doesn't evolve and adapt and become a toaster or a wash machine. It just breaks. It just stops being an automobile engine. This is the difference between systems that are complex and systems that are merely complicated. The complex system has the capacity to adapt and evolve and change to new circumstances, while the complicated system is merely a pass-fail. Does it work or does it not work? We can see this in the natural world, the rainforest. If we have too much rain in one area or too much sun in another area, the rainforest doesn't fail, it doesn't collapse. It will evolve, it will adapt, things will change, a new order will emerge. But do that same thing to a cornfield. Give a cornfield too much rain or too much sun. It doesn't evolve and become soybeans, it just stops working. It just becomes bad corn. The same thing is said about, or can be said about human habitat. While we look at cities of the past, cities that were evolved in this emergent nature, we see that they were designed to survive during bad times, to thrive during good times. They were designed to adapt and evolve to different challenges and stresses. When we look at cities of today, we look at the way we build. Today we build things all at once, and we build them to a finished state. The way we go about constructing these is designed inherently not to be easily adaptable, easily changeable. We overlay this with codes and requirements that things not change. And so we have created, in a sense, an environment that is, in a single word, fragile. One that has all the natures of a cornfield. It either works or it doesn't work. This is very different than habitat of the past. All human habitat throughout human history, prior to our current experiment in how to build new places, were designed incrementally on a continuum of improvement. They would all start just like this. This is my hometown. This is Brainerd, Minnesota in 1870. We can go around the world and see that every city that was founded or started prior to this new post-war way of building began just like this. Dallas, Fort Worth, both began just like this, little pop-up shacks, some people with some hopes and some dreams. We can go further north, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Wichita, Kansas City, St. Louis, Minneapolis. They all began just like this. Manhattan, San Francisco, some pop-up shacks, some hopes and some dreams about the future. We built thousands of places like this in North America. And for a variety of complex reasons, reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places failed. What happens when a place like this fails? Does unemployment skyrocket? Does the stock market crash? Do we have to have an emergency session of Congress to bail out banks? Of course not. These are little bets. It's people trying something. It doesn't work. They salvage what they can. They move on to the next place. We built thousands of places just like this across North America. And for a variety of complex reasons, reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places were successful. And when they were successful, they would grow in this emergent way. They would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. More people would move to the place, raising up underlying land values that would create a natural redevelopment pressure. And over time, these little pop-up shacks would be converted into buildings like this. This is the same street 30 years later. And after another 40 years of incrementally growing up, incrementally growing out, and incrementally becoming more intense, very much like a culture grows in a petri dish, we can think of. This evolving, adapting system responding to stresses and opportunities would grow and adapt and change so that these 2- and 3-story wood structures would eventually become buildings of brick and granite. This is the exact same street 40 years later. Now impose on this complex emergent habitat a more complicated system, one that is more ordered, one where instead of building things adaptively over time, evolving them incrementally, we build things all at once and we build them to a finished state. An approach that's designed to, in a sense, simplify down the things that we're doing. We do this for 70 years. Here's what this exact same street looks like today. And if you want to grasp in a snapshot why cities all over North America struggle financially to do basic things, understand that the community has invested $500,000 in that little stretch of street right there. Where's the wealth that will sustain that investment decade after decade after decade? It used to be there. It used to be there. It's no longer there. Why did we make this shift? Why did we change from a system that was complex to a system that was merely complicated? I think it's important for us to be generous in our interpretations of the intentions of others, particularly those from the past. My grandfather grew up during the Great Depression. He spent part of it living in the neighbor's barn. The neighbor allowed him to live in the barn. He would feed my grandfather, and in exchange, my grandfather would work the farm. This was in Minnesota, so living in the barn in February was not exactly the place you wanted to be, but he felt it was better than other alternatives he had. My grandfather was a Marine in World War II. He was one of the first troops into Nagasaki after the second atomic bomb was dropped. He once told me that he would be dead if it were not for FDR. I don't know if that's true or not, but that was his assessment of the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a time of deep despair and anxiety. Nobody really understood what caused the Great Depression. We still today don't really have consensus on what caused it. You can read economists, they'll explain it, it makes sense. You read another economist, they'll explain it, it makes sense. The two don't agree. We don't have a consensus over what caused it. I think even more critically, nobody knew how to get out of it. Back in the 1930s, the entire New Deal project was essentially an attempt to try many, many different things and see if we could get people working again, get the economy moving again. The only thing that got us out of the Depression was when we took millions of working-age people, sent them overseas in a global war to fight and to kill and to die, and took millions of other people and put them to work in factories building the requirements for that, the tanks, the ships, the munitions required to wage war. When it became clear, mid-1943 or so, that we were going to win the war, the economists, especially those advising the president, started to panic. This is actually a quote from Paul Samuelson, one of FDR's senior economic advisors. They were convinced that nothing had fundamentally changed about our economy. And when we would go then and win the war and demobilize and bring all these troops home, shut down all these industries that were building all these war implements, that there was nothing different about our economy. We were just going to slide right back to 1935 and be right back in the depths of the Depression. And they were panicked. They didn't want this to happen. Of course, we have the gift of hindsight. We know that that's not what happened. What happened is we did something fundamentally different. We took all of that wealth. We took all of that industrial capacity. We were the only major industrial power not decimated by war. We literally had the gold, the world's reserve currency. We had lots of oil. We had lots of coal. We had a nation united against common enemies. We took all of this resource that we had and we put it to work solving the greatest problems that humans have ever faced. If we look back in history, the greatest quandary that humans have had to deal with, how do you share one loaf of bread with two hungry people? You can go back to the Old Testament, you can look at other religions, and what you see is this moral quandary debated over and over again. There's so much want. How do we split what we have between people who all have needs? And these people set out to solve it. Their solution to that problem? Create a second loaf, and then a third loaf, and a fourth loaf, and a fifth loaf. If we could create an economy that would grow, and would grow very, very quickly, we could use that growth, the prosperity from that growth, to go solve all of these nagging problems. And that's what we set out to do. We took all of this capacity we had, and we said, we are going to create a new version of America, one that will grow very, very quickly. And here's the amazing thing. It worked. It really worked. It created a ton of growth. In fact, so much so that even today we still nostalgize those couple of decades after World War II for the greatness that was that period of time. If you just look at the last presidential election, what did we have? We had two 70-year-old, roughly, candidates, both of who were looking back at like the best time of their youth, explaining to us how they were going to restore that to today's reality. Whether the vision was blue-collar jobs, Ozzie and Harriet families, or whether the vision was an expansive federal government that could do things like the Great Society and urban renewal and other programs. They were both talking about the exact same period of time, that magical couple of decades right after World War II, when everything seemed possible. This system grows very, very quickly. What we created was what we call at Strong Towns a kinetic growth machine. This is the city of Fresno, California. We use Fresno because we have really good maps of Fresno. If you look at Dallas, Fort Worth, if we had maps of them, you would see the same basic pattern. Here's the property boundaries or the city boundaries of Fresno over time. So here is that incremental development pattern prior to the Great Depression in World War II. Here's how the city changed in that kind of complex, adaptive environment. That one where we're kind of forced to, from stress and opportunities, evolve and change in a more incremental way. Now, the end of World War II, we kick in that kinetic growth strategy, and here's how the city grows. Very, very rapidly, in a pattern that we now today have become very familiar with. This approach grows incredibly quickly, but it has some long-term consequences associated with that growth. Consequences that, in a more complex system, would have manifested as pain, or manifested as, this isn't working, do something different. That in a sense, when we simplify down and are able to kind of plow through that with more resources, we lack that feedback. My little city, Brainerd, Minnesota, at the end of World War II was 13,500 people. Today, it's 13,500 people. It's 10 times the size. Some statistics from Lafayette, Louisiana kind of paint this a little more clearly. At the end of World War II, Lafayette was a little over 33,000 people. Today, it's a little over 120,000. It's grown 3.5 times. It's a huge rate of growth, immense amount of growth. Yet, when we say, what does it take to provide the city of Lafayette with water? At the end of World War II, it took 5 feet of pipe per person. Today, it takes 50 feet of pipe. It's a 10 times increase. What does it take to provide the people of Lafayette fire protection? At the end of World War II, it was 2.4 fire hydrants per person. Now, it's 21 times that. This system grows very, very quickly. We found a way to grow our cities, our places very, very, very quickly in this kind of top-down, centralized, very efficient system. But what you get when you make things efficient, what you get when you make things top-down, is you lose that feedback. You lose that reaction that says, hey, maybe this isn't working. And so we've crossed over very, very quickly into an approach of diminishing returns, where it takes more and more and more input to get the same amount of output.
Just to clarify, the reason for that growth and demand for those services is because people are living farther apart, they're less dense than they were in 1949.
Let me keep going. I'll show you a map of Lafayette in a little bit, and we'll talk about that in depth. Okay. I lost where I was now. Oh, I remember. It's okay. Yeah, no, you have a development pattern with diminishing returns. We can grow our population by 3.5 times, but we're growing our liabilities by 10 times and 20 times. I think we could explain this to each other. And this would make some sense if we were becoming wealthier. If in a sense that more spread out development pattern was a result of us being wealthier, more prosperous. But when we step back and we look at the city of Lafayette, what we see is that while our liabilities grow 10 times and 20 times, our family wealth doesn't grow nearly that fast. Like most cities, or like all cities really across the U.S., what we see are families saving less, borrowing more, having their net worth stagnate over time, as well as their incomes. There's a fundamental reason why this lack of feedback has resulted in this kind of thing. And this maybe goes a little bit towards getting at what you're asking about. This is a development pattern when we focus on the transactions, when we focus on the growth, the next thing, we lose that complex feedback that tells us we're not doing something that makes sense. Here's two identical blocks in my hometown. The one on the left and the one on the right are the same size, they're the same area, they have the same amount of public infrastructure, they essentially cost the same for the community to provide ongoing service and maintenance to. If you look at them, here's what the development pattern looks like. All three of these blocks once looked like that block on the left. In the 1920s, as my city was growing incrementally, the next increment of out were these three blocks. So what you're looking at here is kind of the pop-up shack equivalent out on the far edge of town. And had things continued here as they had for literally thousands of years around the world, we would have expected to see over time second and third stories, buildings that were more intense, more ornate. As more and more people moved here and the underlying land values increased, there'd be this natural redevelopment pressure that would make these buildings more intense. Of course, that didn't happen. What happened was they were built. We had the Great Depression, we had World War II, and now we have a new development pattern that just skipped right over these blocks and started building out on the edge. These blocks have stagnated for over 90 years. That one on the right used to look like the one on the left, a collection of pawn shops and liquor stores and tattoo parlors. We finally got it torn down, and in its place we got the new Taco John's drive-thru. I've come to understand that in Texas, very few people know about Taco John's. Anyone in this room who's been to Taco John's? No? Taco John's you can think of as like, yes, you have? In Utah. How'd you enjoy Taco John's? It's, I think you can think of it a little bit like Norwegian Mexican food. Do you know what Taco John's is most known for? Do you? Okay, yeah. Did you have the potato oles? That's the thing it's most known for. So potato ole is a tater tot, kind of cut in thirds, so it's thin. It's not a long tater tot. It's a thin one, like a chip almost. Deep fried, of course, with lots and lots of salt, dipped in mild cheddar cheese. just like they do in Mexico. Yeah. So that's the delicacy of Taco John's. Everybody in town was thrilled with this, right? Not just because we like Taco John's, but because we got rid of a block of blight. We got something that is shiny and new. It meets all of our standards that we have. It meets the zoning code. It meets the floor area ratio. It's got the right amount of parking. It's got the right sign ordinance. It meets all the building code requirements. It's got a sprinkler system. It's got ADA compliance. The environmental people showed up. They wanted some native plants. We put some native plants in the stormwater area back there. The bike walk people showed up and wanted a sidewalk, so we put that in. This is able to get financed, sold off on a secondary market. It meets every requirement for new development that we wanted. All those boxes were checked. Here's what nobody bothered to consider. That old blighted rundown block has a total value of $1.1 million. That shiny and new block, it's the same size area, the same amount of public infrastructure, essentially the same cost for the community to provide ongoing service and maintenance, is only worth $600,000. Understand what you're looking at. You're looking at the traditional pattern of development, that incremental, complex, adaptive way we built human habitat for thousands and thousands of years. You're looking at that in its infant phase, after almost a century of decline and neglect. And financially, it still outperforms the stuff we build today, and it's not even close. This is not an isolated case. This is a pattern we see repeated over and over and over. What I'm going to show you now are some productivity maps, maps that a friend of mine named Joe Minicozy and his firm Urban 3 had put together. What I'm going to show you in the third dimension now is value per acre, financial productivity. Think of a cornfield. The part of the cornfield that grows up the most robustly, we say that's the part of the cornfield that's the most productive. That's where we get the most bushels per acre. Well, where do we get the most value per acre? What's the most productive part of a city? I start with Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, New York is a city that, very much like Detroit, was incredibly prosperous prior to the Great Depression, has lost population every single year since the end of World War II, has seen a steady downward decline. I have a soft spot for Buffalo, but Buffalo has suffered a lot of decline, a lot of neglect. Yet when we step back and we say, okay, where in Buffalo is that complex adaptive pattern? Can you point to where the traditional downtown is? Not only is it this massive repository of wealth, but it absolutely dwarfs everything that we built subsequent. We see this in cities of all sizes, of all geographies, of all places. When we look at development patterns, and Joe's group has modeled thousands of them around the world, we see a consistent pattern over and over and over again. Whether it's northern cities, southern cities, large, small, mid-size, coastal, inland. When we look at that pre-depression, complex, iterative, assembled, development pattern, whether it's occupied by poor people or by wealthy people, it doesn't matter. It financially outperforms the stuff we build brand new today. It substantially outperforms financially the stuff that is merely complicated. This is a little city where I live of 1,200 people. When I first went to this place, they said, Chuck, we've got some great stuff happening out here on the edge of town. Let me see if I can get it. Yeah, we got some great stuff happening out here. We've got some great stuff happening out here. But these core neighborhoods in here are just terrible. They're run down and blighted. We've got to figure out how to get some of this stuff torn down and rebuilt. And then we show them where all their wealth is. In the poorest neighborhoods, in the neighborhoods where their poorest people live. One of the reasons I wanted to come here tonight, and we're going to look at Lafayette next, and I hope get to the crux of your question. I think the big struggle that you have in a place like Fate, very much like where I grew up. I grew up in Baxter, Minnesota. I live in Brainerd. They're the same city. They're just there's two municipalities, but it's the same region essentially. Brainerd is the old railroad town. Baxter is the brand new suburban place. When I was a kid, Baxter was 1,000 people. Today it's 10,000. I was involved in a lot of that growth, building the systems, all the new big box stores, all the new frontage roads, all the new subdivisions. The company that I worked for was the primary engineer in most of that. And I experienced all that. I experienced that growth. I watched it happen. The farm that I grew up on that was homesteaded by my great-great-grandparents now has a Forest View school, 5, 6, 7, 8th grade complex, a massive complex across the street. I tore down a bunch of my old tree forts from when I was a kid to build it. All around us now are housing subdivisions that didn't exist, obviously, when I was a kid. And I watched this growth happen, and I was part of it. It was incredibly exciting. When I was a little kid, we used to have to drive an hour to go to the big city to get shoes and to get clothes. And all of a sudden, here, all this stuff was here. We were getting the new Walmart and the new Target, and all this thing was very, very exciting. But I watched my family go through this, where even though we were growing, even though the place was having all this success, tax rates kept going up and up and up. Debt for the city kept going up and up and up. All of the quality of life things that we came to expect started to dissolve and go away. And at the end of it all now, we're in the second life cycle of this, and the city is going out and assessing people and trying to come up with more and more money to keep it all going, and they're really deeply struggling to do it. I'm here because I feel this kind of kinship with people who find themselves having a sunny day and are not used to it, in a sense. Part of growing up in Baxter, where I did, in Brainerd, where I did, Brainerd leads the state in unemployment, generally. And by leads, I don't mean leads as in best, I mean leads as in worst. We tend to have the highest unemployment in the state. Baxter was a very poor backwater of this very poor city when I was a kid. And then all of a sudden, the highway bypass came through. We found ourselves 2.5 hours north of the big Twin Cities region, a perfect tourist destination, and everything just took off. And all of a sudden, the sun was shining, and everything seemed easy. It's very hard when it's been raining a long time and dreary, and you feel like you're scraping, and the sun is shining, to not go outside and let your guard down and relax and enjoy it and say, this is our day in the sun. I think if we could go back 3 decades, we would do things much, much differently. And so the subtitle of our book is called A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity, because the way we look at growth and development is that our cities right now have become, for these very understandable reasons after World War II, basically a cog in a top-down growth machine. One that is centralized in Washington, D.C., centralized in Wall Street, where the next place on the list gets all the capital aimed at them and gets flooded for a decade or 2 or 3 with all the money. The sun shines, everything's beautiful, and then it moves on to the next place, and the next place, and the next place. As a cog in a larger machine. Essentially, our destiny gets taken away from us. And if we want to affect our own future, we have to actually invert our understanding of this system. We have to actually say, in a bottom-up revolutionary kind of way, that we are the ones who are going to be in charge of what this transition will look like. There's a way we talk about this at Strong Towns, a saying that comes from Silicon Valley, but I think is very applicable to any of us that are interested in changing the way things are done. It goes like this. Innovation that happens from the top down tends to be orderly but dumb, while innovation that happens from the bottom up tends to be chaotic but smart. We all have a preference for smart over dumb, and if we ask people, what do you prefer? People will say, I would much rather have systems that are smart than systems that are dumb. But as affluent Americans, as people living in a generally affluent place, we have an extreme preference for order over chaos. We will tolerate a ridiculous amount of dumb so that we don't have to experience any disorder. And if you are wondering what I mean, think of the last time you sat at a traffic signal at 1 in the morning. We have accepted in the things we do a certain amount of dumbing down because we don't want any of that messiness. If we're going to experience smart communities, if we're going to experience smart innovation in the face of all these challenges, we as a culture, we as people, have to become a little more tolerant of messiness, a little more tolerant of trial and error, a little more tolerant of trying new things at a base level where failure can come early and we can learn from it quickly. Let me get to this Lafayette map. This map looks like the other ones I've shown you, but it's really quite different. It's the same in terms of its result, but the data that underlies it is very different. Before I was showing you productivity, value per acre. This is actually a map that you can think of as a profit and loss map. This is Lafayette, Louisiana. I was invited as part of a team that went there to try to help them understand why they were broke. It was interesting because I started this week in Lafayette. When we were there in 2014, they had a $50 million backlog of road maintenance. This was an abject panic because their road budget, they like increased their road budget by 50%, and they were trying to get under control this thing. I found out on Monday their road maintenance budget backlog is now $90 million. So it's gone from 50 to 90 million in 5 years, despite them increasing taxes and increasing the budget. They were struck, why is this happening? What is going on? We don't get it. We're growing. We're doing all the right things. We're making all the right investments. We're having all this, I showed you earlier the growth rates. They're enormous. So what we did is we went through, we spent over a year working with them. We went through every budget item, everything they're spending money on, everything they were scheduled to spend money on, all the road maintenance, street maintenance, infrastructure, all the police and fire charges, the library, all this stuff. And we mapped out what all these things were. So we had dozens of maps that showed where all these expenses were occurring. Then we went through all their sources of revenue. Here's where your property tax come from. Here's where your sales tax come from. Here's where your utility fees come from. And we mapped those all up. And at the end, we mashed all these maps together and said, here is the profit and loss statement for the city. Everywhere you see a blue property is a property that pays more in taxes and fees on an annual basis to the city than they require in long-term service and maintenance. Everywhere you see red, it's the exact opposite. These are places that require more to provide ongoing service and maintenance than they pay annually in taxes and fees. The higher the line goes, the more the disparity is. What's going on here? That blue part in the middle, when I use this cursor, does it show up there? Oh yeah, it does. Great. This blue part in here, that's the core downtown of Lafayette, Louisiana. There's a crescent of blue that runs through this area here. That crescent of blue are the poorest neighborhoods in the community. Here's a snapshot of what these places look like. The upper right hand is the core downtown. You see it's not like a great flashy place. It doesn't look prosperous. The bottom right looks even worse. That's one of those poor neighborhoods. These places look run down. They are run down. When we were going here, the city told us, avoid those neighborhoods. That's where the burglaries happen, the homicides happen, stay out of that place there. From an eye test, these places are not great. Yet when we run the numbers and financially look at them, they're fantastic. They're profitable. They're making the city money. They're literally subsidizing the other parts of the community. What are the other parts of the community? All that red stuff out there? That's the mall, the big box stores, the strip malls, the drive-through franchise restaurants, the gas stations, the cul-de-sac-y streets, the 3-car garage with the attached house, all that stuff out there that we're familiar with. In Lafayette, Louisiana, the median family pays $1,500 a year in taxes to the city. In order for the city to maintain everything that they have built, in order for them to provide all the services that they said they would provide, fix all the pipes, fix all the roads, median taxes need to go from $1,500 per family to $9,200. One out of every $5 a family makes we need to get sent back to the city just to take care of what they've already built. That's not going to happen. That's never going to happen. And so at some point, that $90 million road maintenance backlog and all the other backlogs they have, the city is going to have to make a decision. This is a road we maintain. This is a road we let fall apart. This is a pipe we repair. This is a pipe we let go bad. This is a neighborhood we keep. This is a neighborhood we walk away from. Does this sound like a city that we've talked about already? Like all bankruptcies, it happens gradually, then all at once. I'm going to pause here and just kind of talk a little bit about the mechanism that a city like Lafayette uses to get into a mess like this. If you look at the way the city of Lafayette has grown, it has largely been from 4 sources. The federal government comes in with grants and programs. We will build some infrastructure. We'll pay 90 cents on the dollar. You pay 10 cents. That will create a platform for growth. Remember, we're describing this top-down kinetic growth machine. How do we get the cog to turn so we can get more growth and get next quarter's GDP up? The state government is another role. The state government will do very much the same thing. Here's a program, here's an initiative, here's a tax subsidy. What we want is to create growth at the local level. The bond market is a third source that cities use. What's our bond rating? How much can we borrow? How much can we afford to borrow? What can we turn in our local cash flow into debt payments so that we can do big projects? Those big projects create a platform where we experience more growth. And the fourth is developers, people coming in with capital, largely today from Wall Street, large amounts of money, coming in saying, I will build this, and once I build this, then you, the community, will take over the long-term maintenance and service responsibilities. You'll fix the streets, the pipes, the curbs, the pipes, the pumps, the valves, the meters, all this stuff becomes yours. You'll provide police protection, fire protection, and all those services, but we'll make the initial investment. With all of these methods, what you see is that the upfront cost of that growth for us as a community is made as low as possible. And the exchange we make is that we agree that we will be responsible for the long-term maintenance. When that bill comes due, we will be the ones to fix this stuff. We will be the ones to take care of it. We will be the ones to go out and make good on these promises. There's a 20, 30-year gap between making that promise and the promise coming due. And during that period of time, we as a community enjoy all that free cash flow. All that money from that new development coming in is money that we can use to build a beautiful city hall, that we can use to build great parks and nice buildings, that we can invest in like the next increment of growth. What I experienced in Baxter growing up was a city that had money to do all kinds of things. We were buying parkland, we were installing trails, we built a new city hall, we built a new public works building. We just build all this stuff. Debt was low, taxes were creeping up, but not too bad. We understood it was an investment in growth. Now all of a sudden, we're 30 years plus into this growth cycle. And what is happening is that the city is struggling because all these roads now have to be fixed. All these developments need new resources. All these pipes have to be maintained. All these parks have ongoing maintenance. The police department is growing. The fire department is growing. These costs all keep accelerating. And the tax base now is all stagnant. Furthermore, when we step back and look at it, we don't build cities incrementally now on a continuum of improvement. We don't build them bit by bit by bit and have them increase in intensity over time. What we do is we build things all at once and we build them to a finished state. Think of the hubris involved in that. Only God built something and said, it's done. Now all of a sudden we as humans say, we know what the end result should be. Here it is, isn't it perfect? Humans before us always knew that things were a work in progress, not us, it's done. And when we go out and build that new subdivision, sometimes entire cities all at once in the blink of an eye, we go out and build 40 homes, 400 homes, 4,000 homes, all within a few years of each other. And then what happens 25 years from now? Every home in that subdivision, their roof goes bad at the exact same time. Everybody's driveway fails at the exact same time. Everybody's dishwasher and wash machine and refrigerator fails at the exact same time. And what happens in this style of development? We see it over and over and over again. When everything starts to go bad simultaneously, because there's no mechanism for renewal, there's no way for people to respond to stress, the only thing you can do is just maintain what you have. What we see is that neighborhoods start to go into decline. And what do the affluent people do when they're given that opportunity? They move to the next city, the next place where the sun is shining. And so left behind, with tax rates that are going up, with debt that is increasing, with housing stock that is becoming more and more expensive to maintain, we have people of lesser means trying desperately to keep it all going. This is a pattern we see happen over and over and over and over. It's not even hard to discern. When you look at it and see it, you can see our first ring suburbs, our second ring suburbs, our third ring suburbs. There's a pattern, almost like a slash and burn agriculture, where they go through this very predictable pattern. We have to start having a conversation about how we build places that will endure. And I feel like the hardest place to have this conversation is a place like this. Because not only is the sun shining, not only is like the plants growing in like the easiest way, all of a sudden we go out and plant flowers and they bloom immediately. Everything we do, we look like geniuses. It's just like it's our day in the sun. It's so easy to not have to think about it and struggle with it. Yet if we look up the street, we see those people over there weren't idiots. People aren't leaving that and moving here because we're so awesome. There's actually like a mechanical reason why. We have to slow down, take stock of what we're doing, and ask some really difficult long-term questions about how our cities are going to evolve. I was going to do a couple things here. Let me, I'm trying to think of how I want to make this point. Let me answer your point very directly first. Imagine that you are a very poor person moving to Lafayette, Louisiana, and you're going to build your house. In Lafayette, prior to the Great Depression, prior to this new experimental way of building, a poor person moving to that city, or really any city, would have located on the edge. The edge was where you would get cheap property. The edge was where you could get a start very modestly. You would have hoped that when you got a start, that the city would continue to grow, and when it grew, the value of your place would become more, and you would share in the overall prosperity. This is how people started with nothing and ended up with something. But when you went and built as a poor person, you recognize that kind of the base threshold for making your place successful was going to be that you and your immediate neighbors would basically be able to maintain the street in front of your place. If you couldn't cross that threshold of viability, that your efforts could actually maintain the street, you weren't going to be around very long. And whether that meant all of you getting rakes and shovels and going out and doing it, or whether it meant ultimately your wealth and taxes could afford to pay someone else to do it. If you couldn't cross that barrier, your street wasn't going to be around very long. Like that was the minimum threshold. How would you have built your house? How would you have aligned your house? Well, what you would do is you would build your house narrow and deep. And you would build it narrow and deep because then you would share that burden with many, many, many other people. You would make really good use of the resource in front of your house. You would essentially minimize your individual expense and maximize the number of people you would share that expense with. Now, imagine that instead of having to cross this minimum threshold of viability and getting the painful feedback that it wasn't working if you couldn't cross that. Instead, you become a cog in this kinetic growth machine. And all we're worried about is the next transaction and next quarter's GDP and can we knock unemployment down and how do we continue to grow and what place is having its day in the sun. What happens to your house then? Well, instead of being narrow and deep, It just turns. It just inverts. It becomes broad and shallow. This is how we go from 5 feet of pipe per person to 50 feet of pipe per person without really changing all that much. It's the same house. It's just in a different alignment. People ask me a lot to explain, I'm going to go back, explain this map. How did this happen? I always say to people, it's complex. And it's complex because if I give you like 2 or 3 things to think about, we'll be like, wow, let's legislate those things. But then you go to the next city and they don't have those things, but they have the same pattern. Basically, when you have the complex adaptive pre-war pattern, it tends to be productive. When you have the post-war pattern, the productive tails off the further out you go. No matter what. But let me give you a couple of the things going on in Lafayette, Louisiana, because I think they might help you think through this. So, Lafayette is a swamp. It's Louisiana. If you were a poor person moving to Lafayette to build a city, which every city in all of human history was founded up to our current experiment, every pre-Depression city was founded by poor people. Those are the only people who founded cities were poor people. Where would you have built? In a swamp. You would have built on the high ground. And you built on the high ground because then God would help you drain the stuff you built. You weren't fighting against gravity. So when we look on this map, where's the high ground? Basically, I don't have to go point to it. Everything you see in blue is high ground. There's no cost to drain it. All that other stuff is in a swamp. There's a massive, massive amount of money spent moving water around. Whenever you put in storm sewer, as an engineer, if we could do a project and we could build a ditch instead of a storm sewer, you cut your project cost by 80%. Storm sewer is so ridiculously expensive. Whenever you actually build storm sewer, you should have the most intense development imaginable because it is incredibly expensive. They've got tons of it out there because they build in a swamp. We found places in that blue area where the sewage would run from the house in a small pipe into a larger pipe, flow by gravity down to a lift pump, and then be pumped out to a sewage treatment system. We found places, especially up in the top up there in the red area, where sewage would flow from the house in a small pipe into a large pipe, flow by gravity down to a lift pump, and then be pumped through a succession of 20 different pipes and pumps in order to get to the sewage treatment facility. The city's way of billing says that both of those are a house. And so they both pay the same amount for sewage treatment. But one has dramatically more costs than the other. These are how you get this development pattern. Do you want my favorite one? It's a little abstract, but I kind of like it. And so let me give this one to you. There's a term from biology called thigmotaxis. Thigmotaxis is a Greek word that means wall-loving or wall-hugging. Jane Jacobs, when she wrote about cities, talked about humans as sticking near walls. Christopher Alexander wrote a book called The Pattern Language. He talked about the same thing, how humans have a propensity to stick near the edge. If there's a gap in the streetscape, we won't walk across it. We tend to stay away from that. If you think of a mouse scurrying across a room, a mouse will stick near the edge, won't really venture into the middle. A deer in a field is the same kind of thing. They stick near the edge. If you look at microbes under a microscope, they tend to move in kind of a random way until you put a metal rod in a petri dish, and then this very spooky thing happens. They all start to line up along the edge of the rod and travel in a very similar direction. Charles Darwin described evolution as a conservative process. And by conservative, what he was saying is that we conserve and pass on strategies that are advantageous. So at some point in our past, our ancient past, or our primordial past, it was an advantage to stick near the edge, stick near the wall. And humans, or whatever, we're descendant from, felt comforted by that condition and felt anxiety when they weren't near the wall. So at somewhere in your brainstem is something that tells you that if you're in a space, a room, if there's an edge condition, you're going to feel more comfortable than if you're away from that. Think of walking down a comfortable main street versus walking through a Walmart parking lot. There's a certain amount of anxiety in the latter that is not found in the former. Look at Lafayette's downtown in the upper right. What do you see? An edge condition, a wall, exactly. What do you see in the bottom right, in that poor neighborhood? The buildings line up. They don't quite form a wall yet, but you can think through what that incremental building process would be, as those buildings over time would have thickened up, would have gotten taller, more intense, broader. They would have eventually formed a wall condition. This is like early human habitat. As it changed and evolved, you were going to get that wall. Now look at that stuff on the left. It's completely absent. There's no thought given to this in any way because it's not part of that feedback loop. It's not part of like how we build places, right? We've never had that kind of feedback. Are we having that kind of pain? Yes, obviously. We have record rates of anxiety, of suicide, of depression. We diagnose it in many, many different ways. And I'm suggesting that there are many causes to this. I'm not suggesting that ancients would have not had any suicide or depression. Of course they did. But the idea that we would create places that would kind of subtly soothe our human propensities and instincts, that would essentially be soothing to us as opposed to anxiety creating, is one of these very spooky things about human habitat. We can think of bees in a beehive, and we respect immediately the fact that the bee and the beehive are co-evolved. They're co-evolved to work together to kind of optimize the bee. And we grasp that if we went into a beehive and said, you know what, you would all be happier and better off as bees if we created bee cul-de-sacs and bee frontage roads and different things in here, and you could all have your own little space. We would not be shocked at all if we wound up with neurotic bees. Someone looking at us, from afar, the Martians coming to look at us and study us as a species, would say, wow, they had this human habitat and, it was complicated and messy and it wasn't always optimal and they struggled to make it work. And then they went out and they changed it all. And now they're a bunch of neurotic freaks. Like, what happened? I'm not saying it's the only cause, but we've not done ourselves any favors, right? This is that spooky wisdom. This is how we refer to it in the book. This idea that when you incrementally kind of co-create something, you build something incrementally over time with these feedback loops, you wind up with all these things optimized that we, even in modern times, don't really fully grasp or understand. We can look at things like this. These are in North Carolina. Really, these numbers are very similar all across North America. Here's a Kmart, $384,000 an acre, a Walmart at $967,000. When we go to the core downtown, you've got a abandoned warehouse that's now been converted into a supper club, $5 million an acre. And my favorite all-time place, Jimmy's Pizza, $3.4 million an acre. That's the value per acre. That's the wealth created per acre used. Mm-hmm.
So the difference between Target and Walmart,
Mm-hmm.
why is Walmart better?
I'm not sure what you mean by that. The difference between Target and Walmart?
If you go back,
If we go back here,
Kmart,
you have this is the value per acre. This is the financial productivity. If we go back a couple more slides.
the difference there between those two numbers is due to
If you take,
same size store, same property.
between these two numbers, I have no idea. They're valued differently. The tax assessor went out and said, here's how much this Kmart is worth, and went out and said, here's how much this Walmart is worth. When you take that number and you divide by the acres, you get the productivity. Yeah, I get what you mean.
I thought you were implying
No.
value to the community.
No. Yeah. Well, it's, yeah. Actually, if we want to get,
Sense that.
yeah, if we want to get really deep into it, these are both part of tax subsidy districts. So this is their value. This is not what they pay taxes on. They pay taxes on something far less than this. This is their value, and they pay taxes on this because neither of these are subsidized. But I don't usually go into that because it just is piling on in a way that makes it muddy. Here's the thing that's interesting, and I think very challenging for us here, is that the thing that looks and feels like success looks a lot more like this than it looks like this. Jimmy's Pizza feels like it's beneath us. That is kind of not worthy of us as a community. That we can do better than Jimmy's Pizza. Yet look at the wealth that is created by Jimmy's Pizza. Jimmy's Pizza, that building, is literally like the building block, the central building block that people use to build cities for thousands of years. It's like the first step of building. And look at how much wealth it creates. It makes amazing use of space. I'm going to give you a challenge. I want you to, at some point over the next few days, go out into your city, into a neighborhood somewhere, get out of your car and walk. And when you walk, if you are on a street that has a paved surface, has curb and gutter, sidewalks, if you see manhole covers and hydrants, you're looking at something that's costing you $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 plus dollars a foot to build. I want you to walk it. And I want you to walk it with intention, the way a Strong Towns thinker would walk it. And I want you to go 3,000, 6,000, 9,000, 12,000. And I want you to look to the side and see what is actually there. What you're going to be overwhelmed with, absolutely overwhelmed with, is the realization that much of what we've built, almost most of what we've built, is just gaps. Unused space. Space with nothing in it at all. I was giving a talk in Boise, Idaho, and there was a student there from Costa Rica. And when I showed one of these, a different photo, he raised his hand. And it was funny because I talked to him later, and he really described his disorientation with coming to America. I'm like, America is so rich, they can afford to waste all this land. Like, it's just insane. Here's what he said. He said, in Costa Rica, we are really, really poor. And because we're poor, when we build a block, we have to make sure that every gap is filled in on the block we just built before we build the next block. Otherwise, we won't be able to afford it. We're really, really poor. And so his take when he comes here and he sees us just building stuff all over the place with these massive gaps and all this, he's like, these people are so rich, they can just throw their wealth away like this. So go out and walk it and experience it. You won't get it at 30 miles an hour. At 40 miles an hour, 50 miles an hour, these gaps just fly right by. If you go out and walk it and start to add up the dollars, you will be overwhelmed with the grotesque level of waste that we have in our development pattern. Just astounding. Go ahead, Will.
Say 3, 4, 5,000. Is that the average cost for the water line, sewer line?
Yeah, I'm saying this is like, yeah, this is what it costs to build. And you should get a local version of that. I mean, I don't know what you're paying.
Nope, I'm going to use your number.
Yeah. We're talking thousands of dollars a foot, right? Yeah. Go out and look at it. You'll be overwhelmed. Overwhelmed. Absolutely overwhelmed. So now look at Jimmy's again. This feels like it's beneath us in many ways, but we have all this space. This actually is the building block of prosperity. If we deny the capacity to build something like that, we're really shunning a tremendous amount of wealth and opportunity to the sidelines. What we talk about at Strong Towns as a way to deal with this fundamental problem, and the challenges here are unique because we don't have a fully built out landscape. You certainly have areas that have development, and I saw some of them tonight on the way in, and I've sat down with these guys and looked at some of the maps and looked at some of the developments. What we talk about is building cities that are capable of adapting over time. The idea of building things all at once and building them to a finished state gives you a life cycle, a one generation kind of sugar high with the promise of this long-term struggle. If we can build things incrementally, we can start to deal with that so that we have a pattern that can evolve and adapt. We talk about allowing buildings to go to the next increment by right. Let me walk you through this because I feel like it's an important concept. We build now single-family homes in single-family home neighborhoods. We zone them R whatever, and it's single-family homes. And you can't do anything in that neighborhood except a single-family home. If we go back and look at the way that our ancestors built, if you had a single-family home and the roof started to go bad and you didn't have the money to fix it, what would you do? You couldn't go borrow the money because you didn't have the cash to pay it back. You don't have the money to, what do you do? It's a very common problem. Well, one option that they had that we don't have today in most cities is you would take that home, maybe you would go to the bank and get the money to fix the roof, but at the same time you would get the money to make a little addition on the back or convert one of the bedrooms into an efficiency apartment, create a second door. You would then rent that out to someone else, use that rental income to pay back the loan. Now you were building your wealth. The neighborhood was thickening up in a sense, adding more units, adding more density. While at the same time, you were able to stay in your house, become wealthier, become more productive. We've taken that off the table today. You can't do that. That's not an option. What we talk about at Strong Towns is that every neighborhood needs to have the capacity to evolve and adapt, to change to the next level of intensity. If you live in a single-family home neighborhood, there should be nothing that stops you from having that neighborhood change into a neighborhood of duplexes. If you live in a neighborhood of duplexes, there should be no friction, nothing that really prevents that neighborhood from evolving to become a neighborhood of fourplexes or 4 units. Along with this, though, and I think this is the trade-off, we have to have some essential restraint. One of the big differences between our capacity to build today and our ancestors' capacity to build is that their vision was always constrained by their reach. There was a limit to what they can do because they didn't have massive machines. They didn't have huge amounts of capital they could throw around. They couldn't go out and overnight transform something around like a new fad that came up or a new idea. We can. We have the capacity absolutely to blow ourselves up. And we see cities all the time blowing themselves up financially, blowing themselves up physically, because we have that capacity. So what we say is a little bit of prudence. No neighborhood should experience radical change, but no neighborhood can be exempt from change. We have to discipline our cities to grow. We have to allow them to adapt and change over time, but we should never flood them and overwhelm them with not the pace of change. I'm completely fine with people taking many, many steps, but it's the large leaps. It's the single-family home that goes to 6-story condo units. When we do things like that, we absolutely distort everything about our land use pattern, and we make our cities stagnant, and we push them artificially into decline.
Where does human nature, personal preference, etc., for example, I think people in the Dallas area have been for 40 years trying to get people to ride share, public transit, nobody want to drive my car.
Right.
And you get stuck on the I-30 bridge every morning kind of in the Dallas. Same thing applies to housing.
Right.
I have a I can hear my next door neighbor's clocks. The houses are so close together. So where does that fit into this whole change scenario?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Here's how I describe it in the book, and I think this is the best way to answer that. For me, if you said, Chuck, what is your preference for food? I would say, I love lobster. It's my favorite food. What's your preference for vacations? I would love to take a trip to Europe. That'd be wonderful. What do you like in terms of sporting events? I would love to sit behind the plate at the Minnesota Twins game. I'd love to have season tickets there. That would be fantastic. Here's the thing. I don't eat a lot of lobster. I've maybe had it twice in my life, 3 times. I eat a lot of hot dogs and hamburgers. I'm looking forward to stopping at In-N-Out Burger, actually, on the way home tonight. Thank you, yes? Okay. We don't have this in Minnesota. It's a treat when I come here. I enjoy In-N-Out Burger, by the way. We go camping a lot. Not a lot of trips to Europe in our itinerary. I take my kids to ball games, the Minnesota Twins. It's our favorite team. We tend to sit in the outfield bleachers, not behind the plate. We accept the fact that every preference we have comes at a price point. And that price point is reflected in the actual price we pay. So when I go to the restaurant and there's lobster on the menu and there's hamburger on the menu, I'm making a multi-dimensional analysis. Here's the price for lobster. Here's the price for hamburger. They're seen, they're clear, like I understand that, and I can make a decision on what I value more, my money or this certain type of food. And I, most often, because I'm kind of frugal, choose the hamburger. Okay, go buy a home. Look at the location of where it's at. Look at the price that's being listed. And we're astounded because, oh my gosh, the houses are so expensive, the price is what, all of this. But understand that if the cost of what you were doing was actually rolled into the price of that house, like if the sticker reflected the cost would be bizarrely higher. Like your house would never be built. If all of that sugar high that I talked about, if the people of Lafayette, when they went to buy the house, looked and the taxes weren't $1,500 a year, they were $9,200 a year, what would happen is the housing market would collapse. Like the house would be worth a lot less. Because if I have to pay that much in taxes, I'm not going to pay that much for that house. The development pattern that we've created is expert at growth, and one of the ways we grow so quickly is to actually hide these costs, to push the costs off into the future. So the fascinating thing about like the auto infrastructure is, I want my congestion-free drive. We go out and we build more lanes. I move and locate in anticipation of this added capacity. I go out and I drive and everything works, and then all of a sudden, all these other people show up and they're now using it too. Why? Now it's congested. Now we've got to build more. It is a feedback loop. And so what you wind up happening is that the kind of immediate cost is here, and very quickly the other costs start to set in. The cost of your time being a prime one. There's so many people who move out to the edge and build, and I can get in quick, I can make this work, and then all of a sudden everybody else figures that out too, and now the low cost and travel time you thought you were spending is now a very high cost. Or you were able to tolerate a 45-minute commute, and now all of a sudden the commute is an hour and a half. Because a lot of people could tolerate a 45-minute commute. But now it's become an hour and a half, and it's intolerable for everybody. So it's actually gone above your cost threshold. These are the realities. If we could somehow bring that cost forward and make that cost apparent for you, it would have a very different effect on your preferences. So I'm not a huge fan of preferences. When people come in and say, people want single-family homes, they want large lots, they want to live way out on the edge of town, they want their easy commute. Sure, I want lobster, I want trips to Europe, and I want to sit behind the plate. But if we actually express the cost of those things, people would have very different preferences. One of the things I would love to see us do.
So what you're talking about here is an impact on lifestyle, in a sense. If Wood Creek,
Okay.
decided, we got houses this far apart. If they decide, okay, it's okay to build a two-story fourplex on your lot. Personal preference, lifestyle, you don't, the neighbor's not gonna like it, but it's best use of the land, so we'll let you know.
I'm,
How does that, I don't see how those two go together very well.
yeah, that's an interesting conundrum you bring up. One of these things, and we talk about this at the end of chapter 3, this idea of a good party versus a bad party. If you throw a party and everybody who shows up to your party brings more food, more drink than they themselves consume, what do you do with your party? Everybody who shows up is bringing more food, they're bringing more drink, your party's like hopping. You open the door wide and you say, everybody come in, come in, come in, come in, more people. Everybody that shows up makes this party better. What if you throw a party and everybody who shows up drinks more food, or drinks more drink and eats more food than they themselves bring? What do you do to your party? You put a bolt on the door. You say, we don't want anybody else coming in. Everybody else who shows up makes this party worse. No more people. When we look at pre-Depression development, what we had was a good party. If you look at those streets I showed you, the little pop-up shacks, what was the public infrastructure there? There was nothing. There was no collective cost to that. Just some little pop-up shacks. If you go to that next street with the 2- and 3-story wood buildings, there was a sidewalk. It was a wooden sidewalk that ran the collective thing. The street was gravel, so it was maintained to some degree. There was a little bit of collective cost. You can imagine these people having like a bucket brigade or something. You know, there's more people who moved here, so now we have a little bit more capacity. In that third photo where you had the granite buildings, the brick and granite buildings, you have sewer and water in the streets. You have curb and gutters. You've got drainage. You've got concrete sidewalks. Basically, you have wealth, and the greater capacity allowed them to go in and do these things. So for them, for the people living in that time, the more people that moved there, even though they were close and tight and did all this stuff, the more people that moved there, it gave them the capacity to do more. Let me ask you some things about faith. Do you have paved roads? Do you have sewer and water? Do you have a library? Oh, you don't have a library yet. Police force? Fire department? Okay. You have all the things that every other city has, pretty much. Why would you add another person? What are they going to do for you? Another person is just going to create more congestion, more people using your stuff, more people in your way. Why would you ever do it? So what I feel like you're asking is a very rational question within a very irrational system. We've created this delivery mechanism where we go out and build everything collectively. We go out and build all this stuff. We put it all in place. And then the idea is, okay, we've got this highway, we got these interchanges, we got these frontage roads. Now let's grow, grow, grow. We get out in front of the growth with all the incentive, and then we backfill it. And then it's this fight because everybody who shows up makes it worse. They make our commute worse. They make our parking lots more full. I don't want people that close to me. Yuck. Like if my neighbor's going to make his house a duplex, I'm just not happy about it. There's no feedback loop that makes you have to deal with that. Cities of the past were not utopias. And I don't want anyone to walk out of here saying Chuck Marohn thinks our cities were all wonderful. In fact, they were not at all. They were very difficult places to live. There's a reason why people picked up and moved out when they could, because it solved a bunch of problems immediately. One of those problems was, you're my neighbor, I have to work with you. Maybe I don't like you at all. Maybe you really have a bad attitude. Maybe you and I just don't get along, but I have to work with you. Well, now we can move to different places. We can move and have larger lots. I can put a big fence up. I can have space from you. We fix those problems. You see what I'm saying? But we fix them in a way that is bankrupting us. And we've not had to deal with that feedback. The feedback only looks like when you switch from a complex adaptive system to a mechanical system, an engine, the only feedback you get from your car engine, if it's going to fail, is when it falls apart and becomes unworkable. It might bang a little bit ahead of time, it might knock a little bit, but really, I had an engine fail on me once. I'm driving along and the engine just, things, the whatever blew through the top and it was done. It just stopped working. 1 mile it was working, the next mile it wasn't. That's how these systems fail. And so we've saved ourselves all that painful feedback like you described, like we don't have to deal with that. Gosh, I don't really want to deal with my neighbor building a duplex. Oh, yuck, that makes me uncomfortable. I'm not real cool with that. Okay. But the other side of that is that ultimately you deal with this like bigger. Go ahead.
I'm very much a pragmatist, and so
Yeah.
I love the analogies, and I go, well, okay, rubber meets the road, right? We have developers coming in wanting to do those models they could do. They want to build
Right.
development.
Right.
They don't want to build flat houses at a time,
Right.
right? There's no money.
Yeah.
So there's the crux of
Uh-huh.
how, and people want, and in today's society that now we have, people are used to development of a certain caliber, and I'm used to
Right.
having these civil services, even
Right.
in a small town.
Yep.
How do you grow?
Right.
development?
So you are asking an awesome question, and I feel like you're asking the question that these guys.
He's a P&Z guy.
Oh, you are? Okay. Because you're asking the question that these guys have been struggling with, and I've been struggling along with them. And I'm not here, so I can struggle in it in an abstract way. They've been struggling in like a real way. Yep. So, let's again go back to this machine we have created. After World War II, we needed to create growth. That was how we were going to solve these problems. We were going to create a growth machine. What did we do? The federal government embarked on a huge highway building plan. Along with that, they started to build local roads, county roads, city roads. We had grant programs as late as the 70s where you could get 95% of your local road paid for. Imagine if the federal government would come in and pave like your cul-de-sac. Like they were doing that. That was part of the plan because that would create more growth. They eventually pulled that back because they went broke doing it. But they were building all this stuff. We centralized all these systems. So now we have a centralized standard for roads and streets. If you go to Minnesota, our roads and streets look exactly the same as yours. They come from the same guidelines, the same books, the same federal like DOT standards are descended from that. We centralized financing, where we said if you're going to buy a house in Minnesota, it's going to have the same process as buying a house in Texas because we need to grow, so we're going to make this one system. You can go to a bank in Minnesota or a bank here. You've got a standard checklist of products that you do so that it can be sold off onto a secondary market and securitized with all these other things. The insurance standards are centralized. The building code is centralized. All this stuff is like centralized and efficient. And what happens is we've created a way for developers to essentially deliver a product that has a guaranteed market. And it's a guaranteed market because of the system we've created. It just happens to be a product that is bankrupting you. And so the conundrum we have, and this is why I say this bottom-up revolution, at the end of chapter 5 in the book, I say, look, we're going to have to intentionally opt out of some of these systems. Because the developers would tell you, like, this is all I can deliver, or this is what the market wants, or this is what, people are willing to pay for. And the reality is that's true because in this, like, matrix that we're in, that's really the only thing that you are allowed to build that meets all these requirements. Think about this for a sec. The kind of oldest form of a resilient housing style is a building with and let's make it even simpler than what I was thinking, a business in front and a house in back. How many of us have experienced this, in our life? We've seen these places. There's I remember there was the general store in front and the house in back, and I would go there, and you'd walk in, and it would smell like minnows, and you could get like stale candy bars and whatever. And then the old lady in back, the bell would ring, and she would kind of come up and be crabby. That was the store. Like, I remember having that store in the neighborhood. That product is not FHA sponsored. So the Federal Housing Administration said, basically during the Great Depression and then after World War II, they expanded it, like the program. They said, we will, if you're a local bank, we will insure your 30-year mortgage against default if it meets these criteria. And one of the criteria was it can't have more than 15%, some very low number of the building can be commercial. It has to be residential. There were also things like it's got to be in a certain kind of neighborhood. If it's in a neighborhood that is like of poor quality, different people than us, we won't fund those either. Those have kind of gone away now in time to some degree. But the one commercial were like, if it's more than 15% commercial, you can't get a secondary market loan for it. And so what happens is that the bank, the local bank, has the choice between like two products. If you come in and build a single family home and it meets this checklist of things, it's at least 1,800 square feet, it's got so many bedrooms and bathrooms, we can give you a loan for that at low to no risk for us, because we can within 30 days sell that onto this massively liquid market that, by the way, has federal backing and insurance. And then that will go to pension funds and whatever. Or you could come in and build this kind of house that's been around for thousands of years, this housing style that makes a lot of sense with the business in front and the residents in back. If we do that, we have to hold that on our local bank's balance sheet. At a local bank, we can't do a 30-year mortgage because there's too much volatility in the market. We could give you a 5-year loan with a balloon, maybe, but we have to have 20% down, 30% down, because there's really not a liquid market for that product. So you're going to have a lot of cash to get into it. We're not really sure we want to do it. It's kind of nasty. Now, take that and understand what that building form is. The business in front, the house in back, that's like a diversified housing portfolio. You've got one person who's out of the household working at a job somewhere. You have another one there who can watch the kids, watch the store, make some income while they're doing other things. This is how families build wealth. I mean, this is like a very resilient style of building. That's why you see it all over the place. Now, can't do it. You can only do this one thing. So now fast forward through that, like 70 years of building, where all we build is this one product, and that other product is gone. Look for it. You won't find it. You won't find it in Fate, I doubt, unless it was here a long time ago, because your stuff is relatively new. You won't find it in a second-ring suburb, a third-ring suburb. So you look and say, well, there's an overwhelming preference for this. Yeah, because that's what our system said is the only thing you're allowed to make profit building. That's
How do you work within that system? That's hard.
so here's the thing. I think you have to pick and choose, because the reality is, if you just work within the system, I was just going to say a really naughty word. No, I'm not going to, because we're live streaming, and I don't know who is listening. The system is treating you as their dog, right? Like you're the cog in the system. Like they're just spitting you up. And what I'm saying is that this system is designed to spit you up and chew you out. That was wrong. Chew you up and spit you out. You knew what I was trying to say. That's what the system is designed to do. And it entices you to do that by saying, you're going to have 30 years where the sun's going to shine and everything's going to work beautifully and magically. That's the trade-off, is that you get that period of time. And so you can say, like, yes, we'll enjoy our 30 years in the sun, and then we'll plan on retiring and moving on. The easiest thing, this is why I admire the three of you so much, is that really, at the end of the day, if you were worried about yourself, the easiest thing for you to do would be to let the sun shine as brightly as it could, watch all the flowers bloom, take credit for it because your genius caused it, and then use that to leverage another job where you could get paid a lot more in a glitzier place. Because that's generally what people in your position do. I'm not here tonight to tell you that there's like an easy way to fix this. It is hard. I want you to understand what the challenges are, because literally we're going to have to opt out and kind of push back on some of these things if we want to end up in a different place. Go ahead.
There's a real-time example going on here in the state.
Mm-hmm.
This room was packed with people last night. We haven't put up with our heads with that.
Planning Commission meeting last night?
For proposed development,
Yeah,
high density,
yeah,
housing,
yeah.
and apartments.
Okay.
40-foot lot,
Yeah.
300 homes, 300 something.
What was the big concern?
Oh, the park,
Oh, we don't want apartments.
Apartments,
Ah, yeah.
property values,
Uh-huh.
services.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, I tried to get here from Dallas. I mean, these guys, like, I barely...
Your solution, one of your proposals would be government, you gotta step up, fight back, and tell retired citizens
Local, yeah.
and bring that stuff in anyway.
I don't know. I guess I don't know the details of that. I'll tell you that you...
I'm sorry.
Yeah, please.
The thing, that just goes along the same thing. Let's build the development all at once.
Right.
In 20, 30 years, we pay for it in the apartment flood.
Exactly.
Going down.
Yep.
And continues, really, of going down in value and being run down.
Right.
By building all these huge buildings all at once. As opposed
Right.
to incrementally, what you're saying, but again, developers don't build, class them on the time.
Right. Yes. So you know what? I've had that reference given a number of times, and I'm not totally familiar with it, but like the general concept seems right. Seems right. So like,
People want what they can't afford,
right.
you know, and they're willing to get.
And they're getting it delivered to them. Yeah. The interesting thing is that there are groups of people. There's a group called the Incremental Development Alliance that is trying to grow the number of small developers in this country. Yeah, no, they would be fantastic, and I would love to. I mean, as a follow-up to what I'm doing, the Incremental Development Alliance coming here and doing it would be fantastic. You actually have in a region a number of like noted people who are great incremental developers. I was in Duncanville last night. There's a guy named Monty Anderson with Options Real Estate, who I think is like the premier, in my mind, incremental developer that I've ever run into. There's a guy named Derek Avery in South Dallas who works there, who also does just fantastic work. There are people who do this, but they're not like the default, and they're certainly not the default here. You would have to work at that if you wanted that to happen.
As Michael said before the meeting, 20 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
the city of Fayette sold to developers, basically. And that's why we have it in Pasco. And that's why there's 3,000 more houses can be built in the next couple of years. And traffic. And so
How do you address congestion? That's the only. I mean, really, I'm working on this. We won't talk about that. There's a really good analogy with watersheds and highway systems. If you look at like transportation systems, everybody who drives to Dallas in the morning starts on a little local road, ends up on a collector road, ends up on an arterial, ends up on the interstate, and then sits, right? And you have this whole group. Basically, it's like a watershed. When it rains out here, the rain runs through the ditches and the creeks and ends up in the big river. And if you get a lot of rain, or it rains long enough, what happens in the river? It floods. It's the same thing that happens in our highways. We have all this stuff happen, and we basically have created the same kind of system. We have created a system guaranteed to flood no matter how many people you have. In my little town, 13,500 people, we have a rush hour every day. And if you go out there and ask people, they'll say, oh my gosh, the congestion is horrible. You would all laugh. It's congestion for like 10 minutes. But for the people there, it's unbearable. Because what we have done is we've taken every possible person that could be on the road and we've put them on the road in the same spot at the same time. The only way you get over that, the only way you deal with that, is the same way you deal with the flooding for rain. What do we do so that it doesn't flood when it rains? You have stormwater ponds, you build dams, you basically keep the water from running instantly into the road or into this creek. So the only way you stop the highway from flooding and creating like all this congestion is that you create alternatives that keep that traffic from going there. That means I have to be able to have a job locally. I have to be able to get my stuff locally. I have to be able to walk to what I want to do so I don't have to get in my car. I've got to have options. And basically, Fate is set up. If you look at the master plan of this growth machine, the idea is that Fate would be the next place to basically feed workers into the Dallas-Fort Worth area. You'll be the cheapest housing. You'll pay for that housing by wasting your time every day. That's the cost you would bear. And you will feed the Dallas machine by basically sending your workers in every day. If you want to not deal with that, you have to create local communities, local options. I'm way past the time I usually spend. I've got a little bit left, but I'm not going to do it because this conversation is way better. Let's keep doing this. I do feel a need to be moving on around 8 o'clock because my aunt is waiting for me on like the other side of Dallas-Fort Worth. Do you know where Mansfield is? That's where my aunt lives. And I told her I would come visit her tonight because I'm flying home in the morning tomorrow. Yeah, although I've got to go that way because I got to go to DFW anyway. So it's just like 20 minutes beyond that. But I don't want her to stay up till midnight. So I'm not going to worry about finishing this. If there's anything else, let's chat about it. Otherwise, if you want a book, I'm happy to do that too. So go ahead. Please, Will.
One of the most common criticisms that we get, whatever it is, that most commonly or typically speaking about taxes. People are always saying, well, what about the sales taxes going forward? So just in
Right.
the context of the Taco John's scenario,
Right.
what's the difference between the two models?
It's fascinating. We don't get sales tax data in that way in Brainerd, so I couldn't run sales tax. That being said, there's kind of two ways to answer that. In the places where we have been able to run sales tax, what we see is that there's no difference. The things I was able to do at Taco John's is to go and say, how many people have you employed? How many, and I asked a bunch of questions. That Old and Blighted block has more employees, more local owners, more full-time people, and they use more like local accountants, attorneys, all this stuff than the Taco John's. And so there's a huge property value, wealth aspect to it. There's also no real difference in the sales generated, despite the kind of low value of the liquor stores and all that stuff. But there's a huge difference between kind of what I would just call like the local ownership component of the Old and Blighted block. More owners, more full-time people, more people vested, and more money being passed around the community from that than the other. The sales tax stuff, and maybe we should finish with this, because I think this is a good way to think about what you're being asked to do. I was at a conference with my friend Joe, and the Walmart guy was there. I can't remember his name, but he was head of the Walmart property tax division. And this was a conference, Joe and I were speaking at it. It was a conference of assessors. So the people who go out with like the abacus, these very like blah, boring people. And is there any assessors in here? Am I insulting anyone? They're very like number crunching spreadsheet people They're not the people you invite if you're going to have a fun party, right? And the thing they're most interested in is what is a fair and equitable value for this property. They're interested in fairness. These are not people with political agendas, huge moral crusades. They just want to get the number right. So the guy from Walmart shows up, and he's like, I'm going to help you get the numbers right. You're charging, and I'm going to paraphrase him. He had a more delicate way to say it, but basically, he had hundreds of assessors from around the country in one spot. And he said, you are charging us way too much for our Walmarts. Our Walmarts are crappy buildings. They're not designed to last more than 12 to 15 years. You're charging us as if we're building prime commercial real estate. We're building a cheap warehouse box. And we're building it that way intentionally. Because in 12 to 15 years, we will fully amateurize out that building. And then we will be prepared to board it up, move on to the next place. Or if we decide that this place is generating a lot of revenue, we may extend the life 5 years or 10 years by putting some renovations into it. And all these people are writing this down like, oh yeah, cheap, crappy buildings, lower the taxes. Understand what that represents to you as a community. Imagine you're going down the aisle to get married. And you're about to say your vows, and the minister looks at you, and you say, forevermore, till death do us part. And then your spouse says, 12 to 15 years till the ring is fully amateurized out, and then we'll look at something else. Well, when you do this as a city, you're putting sewer in the ground, water in the ground, road, curb, all this stuff in the ground. That is an eternal obligation that you have. It's a forever obligation. You can't decide, we're going to run the water pipe here, and then 15 years from now, when the Walmart closes up, or 20 years from now, or whatever it is, we're going to pull that out of the ground. Because what will happen is you put it in, and then the next person will go, and then the next person will go, and the next person will go. And you're going to have this huge gap with nothing in it. And what do? Do you pull it out? Do you not? Do you not? So you are creating, as you do this stuff, what are essentially eternal, infinite obligations with a tax base that is designed to be obsolete in a short period of time. And additionally to that, it's a tax base that's not very productive financially. It doesn't pay very high returns for you. In fact, it's negative returning when you amortize it over the life of what you do. And the building itself is not very adaptable. Walmart actually puts covenants on now on what can be used, what the building can be used for afterward. They want to make sure that you don't get a dollar store or a direct competitor of them in their abandoned building. So they will actually put land covenants on that says this can only be used as a Salvation Army or a church or like something non-retail. It can't be used as like an Amazon warehouse because that would be a competitor. So we are making these long-term commitments. And don't blame Walmart. I mean, Walmart is a private sector business working in the marketplace. They're responding to the incentives that we put out. If we say, go ahead, build a cheap building, we'll take over the infrastructure as a forever eternal burden, why would they not do that? It's important for us to understand the trade-off we're making. Because we are, on the public side, you are as a member of the Planning Commission, you are as staff, our elected officials, we're in a sense the board of directors of a municipal corporation. We are stewards of this municipal corporation. The people who live in this community, who own land in this community, are shareholders in that corporation. Our responsibility is to our shareholders, to the long-term solvency. We're stewards of this balance sheet. And yes, we can juice the growth in the short term, but only at the long-term expense of our solvency and our balance sheet. And that's the trade-off we have to ponder as we choose what we're going to do. You have, in my estimation, the hardest challenge that any city in the Dallas Metroplex is going to have. Because the only things you're really offered you are like the poison apple from the vine. That's it. It's really hard to get the other stuff. And so Do you say, we'll go back to rainy days? Do you say, we'll take it all and deal with the consequences 30 years from now? We can all move on. We know what we're doing. Or do you try to figure something else out? And I'm the smarty pants here from Minnesota, and I'm going to tell you, I don't know what that other thing is. We've got some ideas. We've worked on it. We've talked it through. But like when the menu you're offered is all like junk food, how do you find a healthy diet out of that? That's kind of the challenge that your leadership here is trying to figure out. And it's not easy. It's really not easy. So I have a lot of respect, and also I think respect is maybe the best word. I have a lot of respect for the challenges that you all face. And I hope you don't walk away from here tonight thinking, I came here and scolded you and told you were doing all these things wrong, because you are not. You are actually leaders here. But the challenge is very real. And I hope that we can help you and you can help us, and we can take the good things you're doing and continue to share them around the country. And maybe just as a last note, I think it should be said, the work that you have done here in Fate, we have featured many times on our site. Strong Towns site will get, here, let me forward to the very end so you can have that. Our site, strongtowns.org, will have 2 million readers this year. Over 2 million different people will log into our site and read our stuff. We put 2-3 articles out a day. We've got 3 different podcasts. We do videos all the time. We're sharing this information because there's lots of cities that are struggling with the same thing. We have featured your stuff here in Fate many, many times, and you are broadly considered as thought leaders across the country for a type of community that is really struggling with these issues. So the reason I'm here tonight is really to acknowledge that, to thank you for the leadership and all you've done, and to say, these struggles are real, you're not doing them alone, and I would like to continue to try to work with you to figure out how we make this a place great. Because I know you all want it to be. And I know you want it to be because, like I said, the easiest thing for you to do would be to use this as a stepping stone to something else. And even if you do wind up moving on, like the things that you've done here are deeply, deeply impressive. So, thank you. And I really appreciate you taking a Friday night to come out and listen to city planning stuff, of all things. So, thank you. Yeah, from an engineer, right. Hey, man. Thanks so much.
Well, this is the beginning of the conversation, not the end. There's still a lot left to be discussed. We would invite you to go ahead and spend a little bit more time with Chuck before he goes and visits Auntie over there in Mansfield. This has been recorded, and so when you look at this small group of people, you wonder, well, what kind of change can we effectuate? And the reality is, anything that ever was important started with a small group of people who had a resolve and a desire to make their place that they love and care about a better place. So what we've been discussing and what you heard today, and hopefully what we'll continue to learn about together, is these principles and what can we do differently, what has worked in the past, what can we emulate today, and what should we stop doing as well. Those are all part of this important conversation. So we appreciate you so very much for coming out, spending your time with us, because it's truly you that this community represents, and we want to make it the best possible. So in closing, please visit with Chuck, get that book, share this recording with your friends, neighbors, keep this conversation going, and also get some food, because there's some food that is here locally. We're trying to keep our dollars here, Max Barbecue. Please help yourself to that. But thank you again for joining us, and hopefully we'll continue the conversation. Yes, sir?
Where can we find the recording?
It will be posted on our website. Right now, it is being live streamed on some software called Swagit. But if you go to cityoffate.com/live, there's also an archived section, and that's where this video will be posted. And then Chuck also mentioned some of the articles. There was an article published just yesterday, which also references many of the other articles, some webinars, some footage of when Michael, myself, and Will were in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the regional, or it was the national gathering, the first Strong Town Summit, where we have been talking about this for several years. And we're just so grateful that we have some folks to share it with here locally, and that you can carry that message forward along with us. So thank you once again. Please enjoy the rest of the evening. And in case we don't see you before then, have a great Thanksgiving. Thank you.